Welcome to Bedtime Whispers, where darkness comes to life and nightmares become reality. Join us on this terrifying journey through the unknown, where every creak and every shadow conceals a terrifying mystery. Here we go. In my useless 30 years, I have never had a chance to work officially, and it is not that I am uneducated, it is very obvious, and will only be confirmed in the future. The realities of modern life played a decisive role here, rather than my laziness or the fate of a loser, behind which I want to hide so conveniently. It seems to me that many of you have worked unofficially, maybe even are working right now, and some may even be well into their 30s. And for some reason, I have always considered it an indication of failure as a person, as if in this way the invisible hand of being divides people into more or less tasty before devouring their human destinies, and some will fly with a whistle into that famous far away, and some will stall, like me, in one place. Don't get me wrong, this is not a portion of whining or blaming successful people for their success, and God forbid, not devaluing their success. No, I am to blame for all my own misfortunes. I understand that very well. I understand that it couldn't have been any other way. But for the life of me, I don't believe in all these stories about make it and take what you can out of life. If they had all worked, and I wouldn't have ended up where I did, I wouldn't have been in that damned place. I wouldn't have seen what I saw, and I would have continued to live like you, or rather, not like you, but like those to whom I must conform. And that would have been the end of the story. Another NPC bug that hit the wrong trigger zone. Just a line of meaningless code for which such complicated, trivial speculation. Sorry for all the crap above. This is what happens after a very intense emotional and psychological upheaval. And now about them. When I once again get fired from my job, or I begin to be consumed by an internal comedy with always the same plot in the vein of your withering away life goes away, and then I'm gone already. I always find myself alone with this feeling. How would you describe it? Maybe it is familiar to each of you, like a little inner funeral, an indescribable longing. Life seems to turn inside out at these moments. My mind becomes somehow hypersensitive. I start looking for signs from fate and the universe, as if coming to myself after a long and heavy sleep. And if I come across some random fragment of a phrase that my mind has caught onto for some reason, I unravel my thoughts into a tangle until I see nothing there. No, this applies to my unemployed life as well. Maybe someone credentialed would label this as an aggravation, but I think it's too soon. After all, I haven't even told you what happened yet. Given all the water and realities of the just begun and ubiquitous quarantine, it all happened in the 20th year, in early March to be exact. You can roughly imagine the depth of my despair. I was working as a security guard in a small supermarket at the time. and my boss simply wrote to me in a telegram, "We're closing." That's it. When you work unofficially, that's what happens. No water benefits or vacation pay and so on. Thank you, everybody. You're free. Just one day, and I'm unemployed again, and my days are internal again. Funerals I have, like any loser, many friends. The more successful a person becomes, the fewer people around him he can call friends. I think my 15 friends speak for themselves. As in all my episodes of unemployed morning days, I started calling my friends. A trivial "let's go get a beer." Well, and they're in the process. Geez. They fired me. No option to get a job. Maybe I missed this point above, but for me it's very difficult to get used to a new team. The threshold of entry is too steep. This, by the way, is another reason why I sometimes didn't stick around for new jobs and often resorted to looking for work through friends to make it somehow easier to fit into a new team. And so I pulled one of my friends, with whom I had previously worked in a furniture assembly shop during the week. I'll tell you in advance, there will be one strange moment that will come to me too late in all of our sit-ins. The horse won't get out of my head, but what it is, I don't realize any time soon at all. We'd go to the beer house for an hour casually, have a drink, discuss boxing, quarantining, which had just begun then, and slip smoothly into domesticity. He for his lady of the heart, me for dumping me, him for wanting to take out a loan, then me for quitting. And at this point, we almost simultaneously touch work. Listen, I've been meaning to offer you a job. After my answer, yes, here's a layoff from the Crown recently, he named me the type of job and pay, which made everything too suspicious. A very high wage for a trivial physical job, 30 a day. And even during the quarantine period, 12 hours pay at the end of the day on hand. In the 20th year for Kharkov, it was straight up good money. In all this for me, do not think. I have not yet stooped to bookmarking or writing and tag bands on the walls. And hopefully life will never bring me down to it. So everything he told me at the time was treated with the utmost skepticism. That night he gave me one contact in the cart, one contact that cut my life in even slices, like a cake, serving it up in a feast of madness in the face of the next year and the events to come, to the tears of the universe, to her desperate cries, to the signs she sent me in every unthinkable way in that time's slot the week before I went to that job. I wasn't even hit by a car much. I can no longer imagine what could be clearer, but I went there anyway. And as I said in the beginning, I blame myself for all my troubles. For Kharkovites, it will probably be clear almost immediately where my hard fate took me, especially since I lived on tractors at the time. No specific company, no addresses. I will try to describe everything as abstractly as possible. Probably I even will intentionally leave out some things. You'll probably find my mentioning of Kharkov strange, as well as tractor districts. and there may slip a certain illogicality. I mentioned it only for that, like climbers climbing to a great height hammer in safety stakes, or whatever they call it. So I leave these safety landmarks for surrender to me. That height, the peak of experience, which I'm going to tell you about, cannot succumb to me, and I'm left with only these two spatial landmarks. The reason I don't mention the address and the company is because someone might try his luck or check my story. I'm writing all of this here, and you could have a much worse ending, and I don't wish that on you. After our sit-down, I was still hanging around for about a week. Then, as I mentioned, I got a little bit hit by a car and totally morally unmoved. I texted the number my friend gave me, contrary to my expectations of failure or another difficulty at the interview stage. Everything surprisingly went quickly and smoothly. This is despite the fact that the interview was essentially in correspondence. The cards told me, come to work the very next day, and gave me an address. That's when it all started. Saw all these huge shops, hangar plant areas, and just a space where, in the good sense, we shouldn't be. They're usually somewhere in the background on the periphery while you're riding the bus or subway. Such structures, I think, even have their own post-punk soundtrack. When I was a kid, structures like this roused interest, and as I got older, a sense of deep longing that feels like it's always been there. And over the years, it's just remembered as something eternal. To the place of my new job I drove for a long time, then also a long walk, while the ordnance typed in the phone. And there I stood in front of the entrance and the guard booth with the feeling of longing, which I described above. I looked at the huge hangar where I was to go. It looked like the most unremarkable area, of which there are many in Kharkov, something like a factory. A big, long hangar in an endless expanse of concrete fences all around the perimeter. At the very roof were long, flat windows, in which an unpleasant, too bright production light burned. I began to explain something to the overweight and elderly guard, and the purpose of my visit, as he immediately blurted out to me if it was for work there. I pointed in the direction of a large hangar. In front of the building there was a crowd. People, about 30 people at a glance, all without exception male workers, such with bags in black jackets and bizarre dark jeans. You don't notice them daily by the dozens, if not hundreds, as they pass by on the street. And I walked up to the crowd. I smoked and listened to the conversation, from which I understood that everyone is here for the first time today and, like me, do not understand what awaits us next. By the way, I had a similar experience when I called on dubious ads with very good financial promise, and quite often for such ads could sit pretty tortured by life people who, in the end, offered to go and trade or flame or some unpassed a single-use certification toothpaste. Somewhere in the back of my mind I assumed that this would happen, and listening to the background of the assembled workers leaned even more toward my version. And then there was a man who ushered us all inside. We went up to him one by one, and he wrote us down on his list. Then he stood in front of us and began to instruct us. By then, I should have turned around after the briefing and walked out of there, and only remembered it as a delusional dream that didn't have time to turn into a nightmare. But instead I listened to him, not realizing that the nightmare was to become my life, not an ephemeral dream. The man who introduced himself as Andrei Nikolaevich was giving that very briefing. It's hard for me to call it a briefing, but in fact it was a very honest call to leave before it's too late. No matter how many times I tried to reproduce his speech word for word, I failed. But here is approximately its content. My name is Andrei Nikolaevich, and I am your curator. If you have any questions, please contact me exclusively. I answer only in Telegram. Do not call on the phone. Today you will start work. I will supervise you. Each of you will get a number. When I call a number, it means you are not a good fit for us, and we say goodbye. After I call your number, come up to me and I'll count you out. Don't worry, everybody gets paid, even those who don't show up. The nature of the work is not complicated. You have to carry cargo from point A to point B. I say at once. We do not have a smoke break, lunch breaks, and trips to the bathroom. No. If you're not happy with anything, come straight to my desk. I'll give you a token for your trouble. Once again, if anyone doesn't like something, you can leave right away. I repeat, work without a break. You came in late today, but we work from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. 5 days a week. No vacations, no unscheduled days off. Is there a problem? I'm counting on you. Are you sick? Goodbye. Late, goodbye. If you're absent during working hours, goodbye. For the especially forgetful, the rules are at the entrance. You can read them again, just in case. But just in case, no talking amongst yourselves while working. No toilets, no phones and leaving the work area. No lunch and no smoke breaks. I repeat, no. He ran through his speech several times, then pointed to the door for anyone who disagreed. Then 6 people left at once. If my memory serves me correctly, all in all, he put about 43 of us on his list that day. When all the fuss had settled, we were handed out for measurements. Mine was 17th on the list. This is where the first weirdness began. Immediately after we left the pre-bathroom, a semblance of a small annex where the briefing was taking place, we went into the main building, into that huge hangar. There I saw in front a large plateau of pallets with identical cardboard boxes on them. The first one was near the entrance. Behind it was the same one, only about 10 meters away, if not more. The boxes were stacked evenly on top of each other, up to about 2 meters high. Then I saw the other end of the hangar. And here I will probably enrage more than one expert, the distance. But it seems to me that the opposite end of the hangar was 100 meters away. Mirroring the walls themselves, there were the same platforms of pallets on which the boxes were stacked. The boxes themselves were probably, by some standard, about 50 centimeters long and the same, maybe a little less, in width. Ordinary cardboard boxes with no inscriptions, drawings, or extraneous colors. And then Andrei Nikolaevich began to explain the nature of our work. What I heard made me feel strange, or rather, I didn't understand shit. But I didn't argue. You take the box and carry it to the opposite end of the room. There you put it with the other boxes. Then you take the box from there and bring it here. Here you put it to the other boxes. Then you take another box and carry it to the opposite end of the room. Even numbers to the far stacks. Odd numbers to the near stacks. It's all clear, asserting rather than asking. He finished. A couple of people in the crowd rightly wondered, why the fuck would you do that? Whereupon Andrei Nikolaevich mouthed their numbers and said they were free to go. Someone jumped with laughter. Andrei Nikolaevich called his number as well, and unmistakably so. Someone in the back began to whisper. He called out their numbers, and in a couple of minutes about 10 people dropped out. To myself, I thought something along the lines of "whoa, and what?" but outwardly tried to restrain himself, though I knew what was happening. Not quite normal processes. My situation was compounded by the fact that my finances were coming to an end, hanging a couple of loans, and with family everything was quite tight. Perhaps that is what made me stay then, and not leave, as most normal and, most importantly, smart people did. And so the trimming and loud screaming began. We began to move toward the pallets of boxes. Then at the moment of movement, Andrei Nikolaevich called two numbers, and a couple of people dropped out before we even got to work. Then he called 3 more numbers. After we approached the mountain of boxes, then another number. After everyone took a box each and began to head in the opposite direction of anger to another mountain of boxes, and again several numbers. I remember someone in the moving stream got stronger than the others, and Andrei Nikolaevich called his number. As we walked, there was a level of incomprehension in my head that I think outwardly skewed me to match the question mark. To what extent? I must have assumed some kind of primal pose before what was happening, and becoming this skewed figure of the question mark, I continued to carry the box until I reached the opposite end of anger. There, from the loudspeakers on the walls, a couple more numbers sounded, and those who were named waved their hands in an exemplary way, and then left. Then I went back with another box. At the beginning, I mentioned that I was extremely uneducated and illiterate, but even such a dullard like me, from what was happening, gears in my head began to turn. What I just did not think while we were carrying boxes back and forth, and Andrei Nikolaevich kept calling out numbers, after which people were leaving. By the way, If in the beginning I was able to trace some logic in his selection, then as time passed, any of my assumptions about what he violated the people he called did not find any, even primitive, reasons for their elimination. And I kept wondering what the fuck was going on. Thought maybe there were cameras somewhere, or it was all part of a show or a prank. I even thought maybe it was some kind of experiment or something. That maybe someone was laundering money this way and making it look like they were working behind closed doors. Then for some reason it seemed logical to me that all of this was nothing more than a gathering of some sectarians or their mad training. Then the vector of my thoughts shifted to something more down to earth. I began to wonder if what was happening could be a rehabilitation center for ex-alcoholics, drug addicts, and convicts. They are developing socialization and humanistic skills toward work and an honest life, which is not usually their thing. Then I started sweating almost coldly, remembering the movie 13, where they shot each other in the head. These thoughts made Darknet and all kinds of death and torture rooms come to mind. I had never seen them, but I thought that's how they started. So I walked with the box in my hands, first one way, then the other, while a festive salute of paranoia, fear, and misgivings went on in my head somewhere. After an hour of our work, walking ahead of me through several people, we walked in a chain behind each other. A rather strong dude somehow stiffly began to resent out loud. He did not know who to snap at. Threw the box to the side and began to begrudge Andrei Nikolaevich, while everyone continued to move along with the number of this type. Andrei Nikolaevich called to more numbers of those who turned to shout. To the bull, the dude got support in the form of those two people who had just been named, and already the three of them began chanting to the entire hangar. By this time I had already reached the opposite pile with the boxes and was going back, so I could see what was going on clearly and did not even have to turn my head. From a small door at a distance from the entrance for stout calves, real muzzleloaders came out and pointed indignantly to the door. They somehow became quiet in a flash, and following the guards without resistance, they left. Everything was very strange and ominous before, but after I saw these butchers, I had absolutely nothing to hide my growing anxiety. I just kept walking, further carrying boxes from one pile to another. Then after a couple more hours, my nerves gave out. All I could hear from someone behind me was shouts directed to nowhere. Why are we doing this? What's the point? Hey, somebody, doesn't that embarrass you, man? No one stopped or even turned around at his shouting. Judging by the fact that Andrei Nikolaevich only called his number, most of them, just like me, guessed how things worked here. So past the first day in anxiety, fear, and incomprehension, the rewards of what we were doing were working. I do not have the tongue to call it was quite a fat envelope. Andrei Nikolaevich was tearing up at the end of the day, triad, and about how we were honored to work here, saying that we got little rewards from above, and each of us really deserved the job. He talked for quite a while, but most of his speech has been erased from my memory, and I can only vividly remember my own chaotic thoughts. How I was afraid we would be told something along the lines of, "You suit us," after which we would all be taken apart for organs or taken out into slavery. The thought of slavery and some kind of unthinkable underground labor lingered in my mind more than any other. With it, I was leaving through the gatehouse and saying goodbye to people who seemed to be experiencing something similar, and that thought drilled into my skull from the inside on the subway, and as I lay in bed, remembering the day before, I can't remember now. But I am sure that the plot of the dream I had that day was poisoned by these grievous and incomprehensible experiences. And so, based on all of this, on all the anxiety I had experienced during the day, on all the negative impressions alone, I could think of nothing better than to go there again the next day. Maybe it was the $100 earned that day that made me do it. Or maybe it was that new and first feeling in many years that something unusual, interesting, strange, and real was happening. I think many of you can understand me. Everything I had encountered before was just routine and routine and routine again. And this was the first time I felt like I was part of something bigger. If I had been a little smarter, I wouldn't have had to write all this. And I certainly wouldn't have gone there again the next day. To my surprise, everyone I managed, so lazy otherwise to remember, showed up for work in the morning. I was guided by numbers rather than looks. All in all, there were about 20 of us. I don't remember exactly. Now, instead of simple paper numbers, everyone was given vests with numbers embroidered on the back. After getting my number 17, I followed the others back into the hangar, where there were just us, me, Andrei Nikolaevich. No huge guards, just boxes. Someone in our crowd decided to make a joke and mouthed something along the lines of, "Well, shall we open one box?" After which his number sounded from the speakers on the wall. He started waving it off and yelling, "There," which he didn't want at all. But it was too late. Again, a couple of buoys showed up from behind the door, and he was led out without much trouble, and everyone around them froze and began to wait. No one dared to go first, box, or do anything. Everyone stood there in silence. Then a loud "time to work" came from the speakers, after which everyone moved to the boxes and started carrying them, like yesterday, from one pile to another, again and again. In my head, I tried not to untwist any logical and similar spirals as to why we were doing this. What was the point? Just taking a box from one pile, taking it to another pile, putting it down, taking another box and carrying it back, over and over and over and over. The day went on. We were working and, like, everything was absolutely fine. I usually didn't focus as much on the feeling of anxiety that was with me all the time anymore. I was thinking more about money, about how great it would be to solve all the financial problems. Man, I even caught myself for a moment thinking that this one was almost my dream job. The boxes weren't heavy, but 1 or 2 pounds at most. The bosses weren't there. Nobody was doing anything. Nerves and everything seemed more or less normal. And then someone up front yelled. It was a rather massive man, and somehow not to his liking. He shrieked subtly and flew out of the line, tossing the box, as it seemed to me, away from himself. His number didn't come out of the speakers. The man ran so sharply and quickly that he managed to get out of anger before his number was called. Or maybe it just wasn't necessary. For some reason, I also remembered his number 3. After his shouting, I felt a little uncomfortable. I tried not to show it outwardly, so I continued, along with the others, to carry the boxes on. Someone in our line decided to pick up the abandoned box and went after it. His number sounded from the speakers. It was sort of the first official day. It also left me feeling anxious, but I didn't leave. And the next day I was there again. After my first day at work, Andrei Nikolaevich wrote me in a telegram. I want to mark it separately, because further on he will constantly write to me. After all sorts of strange episodes during work, he wrote, "You are very good. You are entitled to a bonus." This is verbatim in the text. I didn't have the best way of conveying these letters, but the end and I were kind of mirrored, but they didn't stand out in any way, as if those letters were in his phone layout. I remember thinking that it was funny how such a big man had a dummy phone, with the alphabet knocked down. His premiums were another 50 added on, like he was supposed to for the day. Total 80 a day for just lugging a box from one country to another. The new day was no different. I also arrived early for work, and there, like yesterday, was already a crowd. For some reason it seemed to me that everyone started to shun each other somehow. Maybe they, like me, assumed that a number could be called for this. So they decided not to try their luck too much and behaved in a cramped manner. Once again I noted that we were quite similar to those people, especially in terms of discretion. Pretty soon we were launched inside anger, and we got to work. Once inside, I immediately noticed how badly everything reeked of chlorine. The smell was so strong that I had to squint. Now there was one plateau with trays instead of 2, and we walked in a very tight snake behind each other. Something seemed to have changed in the hall. I spent the rest of the day trying to figure out what it was, but I couldn't figure it out. At least something on the periphery of my mind kept me busy. Somewhere the next 2 weeks were quite normal. No one called a number. Wages were given steadily at the end of the day. I did not notice any particular oddities. At the weekend I paid off one loan, and to celebrate it I showed off in front of friends. And then there was Sunday, from which it is more correct to say the beginning of the end. There is a phrase in the English language, "first day of the rest of your life." I think it was Brian Mall who sang a song in a duet with some dude in the early noughties. This phrase had been sitting in my head for a long time during the actuality of the song itself, but I only began to understand its real meaning on Sunday when I went to the market to buy things. This is the first day of the rest of your life. When I went to the market on Sunday, it was day like day. I wandered through the endless stream of people, pricing myself up, looking at the walls littered with things, and then it was as if someone called out to me in the crowd. In such crowded places, it is more likely that someone else will be called, even shouting at your back. So I kept walking and didn't turn around. Then the call came again, much closer and thicker. I kept walking anyway and didn't turn around until someone tugged me by the sleeve. When I turned around, I saw a skinny kid. He looked really scared and tortured. He started something along the lines of, "Don't you remember?" I remember, and I thought, of course I don't recognize you. You're a super old grandpa. Why should I recognize you? But he kept going on and on. But we worked together, and I looked at him and tried to remember where I could have worked with him. And he kept saying, "Remember, we used to carry crates." Crates. While I was standing there dumbfounded, my grandfather kept talking and began, as if remembering, to name more details about the big hangar and the numbers. And then, as if he had sobered up, he let out, "What was it like there then?" Number 3. Exactly number 3. The grandfather, pleased with himself, somehow instantly found clarity in his eyes and began to remember himself and, unnaturally merrily muttering something under his breath, dived into the stream of people and then disappeared from sight, absorbed by the continuous mass of the market. While I was digesting his words, Grandpa seemed to be just an old flavor, because he wasn't even there in the first place. There was a rather large man there, whom I would have recognized on the street if I had killed him, even though I distinctly remembered the man, number 3, as he ran out of the hangar. From there, things developed much more rapidly. Monday began with the fact that when we were all let into the hangar, in addition to us there was another stranger in the room. I did not see him immediately, only after taking a box and heading to a pile of other boxes. The man was sitting in a chair, looking straight ahead. It would have been all right, but his chair was facing the wall. The chair was somewhere in the middle of the hangar, and whichever way I walked, I couldn't see his face, but all I could see was a silhouette. The most normal-looking man under 50, with his hands palms down on his lap. I'll admit that the sight of him frightened me a little. It wasn't so much his appearance as the strangeness of him being here. I tried not to stare at him too much, for fear that I might disrupt something. I had already called my number and watched him only out of the corner of my eye. He did not move once in the 12 hours and just sat staring at the wall in front of him. The next day was even stranger. The table was in the same place, only there was no man on it. There were only a couple of unnaturally bright drops of blood that literally glowed on the glossy white floor. And that was the day it was supposed to end. The blood was already a clear signal of the maximum beyond the maximum abnormality of what was going on. Then someone's number was even called, and the kid shot and flew out of the hangar. It would have been better if it had been me. Instead, I kept carrying the box, trying to avoid looking at the area where the chair was standing and there were drops of blood. When I went to work on Wednesday, I still had my worst premonitions on the subway ride, and it wasn't long before they paid off. The strong smell of chlorine reappeared in the hangar. It was so burning that everyone coughed non-stop, and there were tears coming out of my eyes non-stop. At one point I even thought, will they go to hell? But something seemed to be holding me there. What it was, I could not realize. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was something more, and I tried to analyze myself. I really did, but I didn't seem to know much more about myself than I could imagine. And I guess one of those darker sides manifested itself in some kind of inner desire not to be called by a number. I don't know whether it was a challenge to myself. It's probably pointless to speculate about that now. I remember we kept working. Everyone was coughing a lot, and then a man collapsed somewhere in the distance. No guards ran out. They didn't call his number. Nothing. He continued to lie on the floor, and everyone walked by and coughed, just shifting the route a little bit himself, so as not to step over him. And I kept waiting for one of us to rush to his aid. Then I would have run up and spit on the job, too. But no one helped him. Everyone kept carrying boxes while he lay motionless on the floor. He was left lying on the floor, and after the workday was over, and again I was waiting for someone to go in his direction, then I would have gone the same way. But everyone headed toward the exit in one mass, and the man stayed there. In the morning, he wasn't on the floor, and he wasn't at work either. I can't explain now, either to myself or to you, why I went there again. What happened to that man was beyond morality and beyond my fears. But I was there again, and a new day brought another gruesome episode. It was business as usual again. Boxes, boxes, and more boxes. Earlier I said that the second plateau of boxes had been removed, and there was only one mountain of boxes in the room. It turned out that we walked in a chain, and always, as I walked there to my left, someone would walk toward me. Usually I tried not to even look at anyone, so as not to accidentally break the invisible rule. I mostly oriented myself from afar, and as I approached something I saw, I looked at the floor or directly in front of me. That morning, however, for some reason I couldn't help but notice the number 25 pacing toward me. Every time we crossed paths, it was as if he was tilting the head of the box in his hands. As he passed me, it was only on the precious occasion that I realized he was listening for it. In doing so, He seemed to be trying not to give himself away, but I knew that if I could see it, it meant that his number would soon be called. And indeed, it was called much later, when he did not hesitate to put his ear to the box and listen to it with eyes full of horror. From the loudspeakers it kept going. Number 25, number 25, and the guards came out of the room, and he kept listening to the box while tears streamed down his cheeks. I distinctly remember his eyes filled with some kind of animal fear and his head twisting convulsively from side to side. For the first time ever, the guards had to do a lot of work. They dragged him under his arms while he screamed. No, that's not true. No, it can't be. I don't know. There was something about the way he looked. It made the back of my head tingle unpleasantly after what I saw. For the first time, I was afraid exactly to leave. They continued to be in this extremely strange place. Much scarier for me was the fact that for the rest of the day I also heard some whispering. Thank you so much for your attention. Subscribe to the channel. See you soon.